This video contains discussions of human cannibalism that some viewers may find disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised. I want to open this episode with a story of two voyages and two encounters. The first voyage is the story of a man setting out to the west to find India and encountering a new and strange land. No, we aren't talking about Columbus, but rather one Pedro Alvarez Cabral. In the year 1500, he led a Portuguese fleet into the Atlantic Ocean en route to India, trying to replicate Vasco da Gama's trip from Portugal to India. Setting a wide course to catch favorable winds, he unwittingly sighted land on the coast of modern day Brazil, and on April 22nd, 1500, the expedition made landfall off the coast of Brazil where they encountered the local Tupinambá people. The expedition's chronicler, Pero Vaz de Camina, recorded that they graciously accepted gifts, assisted with resupplying the ships, and even danced when a crew member played a bagpipe. For 10 days, the Portuguese and Tupinambá enjoyed each other's company without incident. Just before the fleet's departure, priests set up an altar and cross to celebrate Mass, and not only did many natives attend, but some participated enthusiastically. This gave Camina and the priests hope that the Tupinambá would make ready converts to the Catholic faith. By the time the fleet departed, spirits were high and hope was in the air. What a wholesome encounter! But now let's turn to another voyage and another encounter. 1 year later, Amerigo Vespucci returned to the coast of Brazil by orders of King Manuel I of Portugal to reconnoiter the Brazilian coast. Like Camina the year before, Vespucci came into contact with the Tupinambá natives, but things went sideways real fast. After some initial trading, some sailors went ashore to make contact when one of the men was suddenly attacked and clubbed to death. After fleeing back to the ships, Vespucci reportedly witnessed a great bonfire built that was visible from the shore, and to their disgust and horror, the crew watched as their dead crew member was cooked and eaten by the natives. Whether or not this occurred exactly as Vespucci reported, it triggered a dark counter-narrative to the Tupinambá. Rather than innocent, childlike natives, these were violent, bloodthirsty people that gave no quarter and deserved none. It's interesting that such early accounts differ so markedly in tone, but in a way, they set the stage for how people thought about the Tupinambá and by extension the wider Tupi people after contact. To later writers, the Tupi have been caught between extremes. On one hand, they were perfectly innocent people living in a beautiful utopia, while to others, they were cannibalistic brutes. It's been easy to slot the Tupinambá into either one of these sides, but today I'd like to offer a more nuanced view of the Tupinambá, because there's far more than meets the eye. It's easy to imagine the Tupinambá as a coastal people, but in fact, they were people with roots deep in the Amazon rainforest that had migrated and adapted to a new life on the coast. It's an incredible story that spans thousands of years and thousands of miles. So in this episode, let's turn our attention to the Tupinambá and discover how they left their Amazonian cradle and ended up on the coast of Brazil, greeting the Portuguese. Before we get rolling, we need to establish who exactly we are talking about. We are discussing the Tupinambá people, and depending on what source you consult, it can refer to either a specific Tupian-speaking people living in a few sections of the Brazilian coast, or all coastal Tupian-speaking people. Even among scholars, I frustratingly found that this term was used inconsistently. It's a very flexible term that often turns into something of a catch-all. Based on sources available to me, I am going to consider the Tupinambá as those who lived on the Brazilian coast from what is approximately the border of modern-day Sao Paulo state up to the São Francisco River in Bahia. Just know that some of the sources may expand or restrict this range. Now, the Tupinambá were one of several Tupi groups living on the Atlantic coast of Brazil, with a lot of shared culture and a common ancestry, so there's a lot of overlap. So why are we focusing on the Tupinambá? That is because the Tupinambá were among the first people in Brazil encountered by Europeans, and this gives us many wonderful sources that allow us to see Tupinambá culture at the moment of contact. On that note, let's go over our sources. We are lucky to have several accounts from people who lived among the Tupinamba and documented their experiences in incredible detail. One particularly important account about the Tupinamba comes to us from Jean Delisle, a French colonist who spent many months living among the Tupinamba in Niterói near modern day Rio de Janeiro. Later in his life, Delisle would publish an account of his time in Brazil and his time among the Tupinamba, and his account provides us with rich details of Tupinamba culture. Another account from the same expedition comes from André Teve, who also wrote an account of his dealings with the Tupinamba. A third noted contact is Hans Staden, who was held prisoner by the Tupinamba and made a record of his captivity, although it's worth noting that certain elements of his work have been disputed. I mean, when you have a sensational title that reads an account of cannibal captivity in Brazil, no, that is not a joke, you should probably approach it with a bit of caution. Nevertheless, his work does remain an important source, and much of the information can be corroborated with other sources. Other important accounts come from Jesuit missionaries who lived among the Tupinamba and established missions for them. Letters from priests document many cultural and social practices of the Tupinamba. Thankfully for us, scholars can also compare these accounts with traditions of modern Tupi people today, and can also use their traditions and oral histories as well. But we also have other sources: archaeology, linguistics, and genetics. Archaeology allows us not only to recover the material culture, but can also shed light on ancient movement and land use. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the origins of the Tupinamba lie in the Amazon, and archaeology in the Amazon is tough. The moist air, heavy rain, and acidic soils are a brutal environment for preservation. In fact, a 2011 survey of Tupi Guarani archaeology that I read noted that almost no skeletons have been found at any Tupi Guarani sites. While this doesn't give archaeologists a ton to work with, we'll see later on that they have found clever ways to identify human activity. What's more is that archaeology across Brazil, and especially the Amazon, is very uneven. Some areas of the Amazon remain largely unexplored, and others only lightly touched. Thankfully, this is changing quickly, and there's actually lots of new archaeology happening in the Amazon, but that also means that new discoveries could change our understanding. Linguistics also gives us insight into tracking the Tupinamba. The Tupinamba spoke Tupi Guarani languages from the fittingly named Tupian language family, and these languages can be found all over South America. In fact, the Tupian language family has historically been one of the most spread out language families on the continent, and ethnic Tupi people can be found in various places across modern day Brazil. By studying how different Tupian languages are related, scholars can get an idea of how the Tupi migrated and expanded in ancient times. Adding to this picture in recent decades has been genetic studies. Modern DNA studies can also shed light on how ancient and historic populations have moved and migrated over the centuries. One last disclaimer: I do not speak Portuguese, but have done my best to get the pronunciations right. I'm sure there will be errors that will be painful for Portuguese speakers to hear. To all of you in the audience, you have my apologies in advance for any mispronunciations. Please be charitable in the comments. Despite our story beginning on the coast, we actually need to discuss the Amazon because it's the proverbial cradle of the Tupi people. The Amazon basin is an incredible hub of biodiversity. Most of you probably think of the Amazon River and the rainforest, but the basin also features tropical savannas, wetlands, and mountain forests. That said, the Amazon gets something of a poor reputation as a home for humans and civilization. Archaeologist Betty Meggers famously called the Amazon a counterfeit paradise in her book, Amazonia: Man and Culture in a Counterfeit Paradise. Meggers' thesis was that the Amazonian environment constrained social and cultural development. Acidic soils, dense forests, and tropical weather were forces that barred its inhabitants from attaining any sort of cultural complexity and kept them living in small, primitive communities. Now, I'll admit that if you're not familiar with modern Amazonian scholarship, there is some superficial appeal to this theory. Back in my early 20s, when my confidence and naivete were simultaneously at their peak, I would have bought this thesis, no questions asked. However, the truth is actually far more interesting, because since Meggers' work was published in the mid 20th century, there's been a lot of archaeology and ethnographic work that's really pushed back against this idea. Rather than imagining the Amazon as a land of constraint, I think it's better if we think of it as a land of opportunities that successfully supported large populations. Humans have been living in the Amazon for at least 13,000 years, And in fact, the Amazon provides us with the earliest known pottery in the Americas, courtesy of the Taparinha site, which dates back to about 5100 BCE. To put that in perspective, that's more than 2,000 years before pottery appears anywhere in North America and Central America. Perhaps the best evidence of a thriving population, however, can be seen in the interactions between Amazonian inhabitants and the plants around them. Across the Amazon, ancient peoples domesticated a dizzying array of plants. The ones that you are most likely familiar with are sweet potatoes, manioc, chili peppers, peanuts, squash, pineapple, cacao, papaya, tobacco, peach palms, guava, and even rice. If I didn't stop there, we'd have over 120 more species to go. If you like peanut butter and chocolate, you owe it to the Amazon and its indigenous peoples. I know this is a large geographical area, but even so, that is impressive, and it speaks to the Amazon's role as a center of plant domestication and as a cultural incubator. In fact, early historical accounts of explorers down the Amazon River and its tributaries recorded numerous large, complex sedentary societies that controlled large territories that they fiercely defended. Settlements there were recorded as having between 800 to 3,000 people, with some having populations as high as 10,000. These were not primitive jungle people clinging to a grueling existence. They were thriving. As we'll see, however, colonization, disease, and displacement had a devastating impact on these societies and cultures. With that as our background, let's look at the origins of the Tupinambá. Now, this is a topic that has been debated by Brazilian linguists and archaeologists for over a century. I'm going to spare everyone the history of the debate here, but if you're interested in diving into it, check out Francisco Silva Noelli's work in the bibliography. The modern and current consensus is that the Tupi, including the Tupinambá, have their origins in the Amazon rainforest and that they moved out of the Amazon and down the coast. Now, you might be expecting me to trot out a lovely pottery sequence or tool tradition, but the best line of evidence for this is actually linguistics and genetics. One of the first things that scholars noticed about the Tupinambá was that their language was related to many languages in the Amazonian interior, and that these languages must have come from a single ancestral homeland and expanded from there, similar to how Proto Indo European languages are believed to have originated in the Pontic Caspian steppe before spreading out to Europe, Anatolia, Iran, and northern India. Linguists have been able to classify how these Tupian languages are related. Now, just to make sure we're all on the same page, let's look at this handy chart of Tupian languages. The Tupian family is divided into eastern and western branches. One of the families on the eastern branch is the Tupi Guarani language subfamily, and it's this subfamily from which the Tupinambá descend. Going back to the chart, though, what scholars are interested in is when and where those eastern and western branches split, and subsequently when and where Tupi Guarani split from the eastern branch. To answer those questions, linguists have analyzed these languages for similarities and differences to reconstruct their evolution. Many linguists have proposed theories about where the Tupi originated. The broad consensus is that the Tupi originated between the Madeira and Guapore rivers in the southwestern Amazon. This region contains the largest concentration of Tupi languages, which suggests that they've been there for a very long time. Genetic studies have also bolstered this idea in recent years, though authors have noted that we lack genetic studies on many Tupi-speaking groups, so there are gaps in our understanding. Okay, so now that we have our place, let's look at these Proto-Tupi speakers briefly. Although we have to generalize a bit because of the limited archaeological record, we can say that Proto-Tupi were well adapted to life in the Amazon and had built up a robust agricultural tradition. As we mentioned earlier, the Amazon was a hub of plant domestication, and the southwestern Amazon was no exception. Many plants had already been domesticated, and by the Middle Holocene, between roughly 6000 and 2000 BCE, they were starting to spread across distant populations in the Amazon basin. This is also the period where foreign crops, especially maize, began to move into the Amazon from the Andes. Based on archaeobotanical studies, we can say that these Proto-Tupi people in the southwest Amazon were cultivating sweet potatoes, manioc, peanuts, Brazil nuts, squash, maize, and other fruits and plants. Besides just growing crops, they took an active role in shaping the environment around them. Using fire to clear sections of forest, they could encourage the growth of fruit and nut-bearing trees, which would have resulted in very productive forest gardens. We also see some early signs of terra preta and dark earths in these areas, suggesting that the people were staying in one spot for extended periods of time or returning after long intervals. For the uninitiated, terra preta is a dark black earth created from human activity and the accumulation of organic substances, especially burned and charred materials. These charcoal and organic materials in the soil allow the normally poor Amazonian soils to retain nutrients far better, and this soil would have permitted people to grow very nutrient demanding crops. Terra preta doesn't really take off across the Amazon until later, but I bring it up here to emphasize that these people were right at home in the Amazon and knew how to live comfortably. Now, don't get the idea that these people were living in the same settlements for generations or anything. There was still a mobile element to their lifestyle. Settlements would be abandoned after several years as the soils lapsed. So, although they practiced agriculture, after some time, they would locate a place for a new settlement, prepare the site, transport their plants, and resettle. These people were constantly on the move, so it makes sense that as their populations grew, they went up and down the rivers to search for new lands to cultivate. These Proto Tupi populations appear to have expanded northeast following tributaries of the Amazon. Linguists date the origin of Proto Tupi to about 5,000 years ago, and if that is correct, it would put the initial expansion sometime between 3000 and 1000 BCE. Either way, they expanded out of that original Madeira and Guapore region down the Amazon. Around 3,000 years ago, at 1000 BC, the ancestors of the Tupinambá really come into focus in the archaeological record, because they can be very reliably traced to a specific subfamily of the Tupian language family, the Tupi Guarani, who at this time were very likely living between the Xingu and Tocantins rivers. Now, we need to stop and discuss the Tupi Guarani because they are important to the next part of the story. Like their ancestors, they were well adapted to a riverine forested environment. They would have had a reliable set of crops that they could farm, and centuries of experience promoting the growth of useful trees in the forest, as we saw earlier. Archaeologists have also identified a specific ceramic tradition appropriately labeled the Tupi Guarani ceramic tradition. These ceramics are defined by their cord marked manufacture, temper from ground sherds or minerals, and red, black, and white pigments with geometric motifs, although corrugated pots appear as well. Scholars believe that these people were organized into regional chiefdoms based on confederations of different villages and settlements. The Tupi Guarani and their descendants, as we'll see later, were known for their bellicosity and organized war parties to move up and down river to attack enemies, capture women and slaves, and expand their territories. They could be a pretty rambunctious bunch. Now, so far, I've depicted this as a movement of people based on language and archaeology, and some skeptics out there might rightfully point out that linguistic connections do not always correlate with ethnic connections. How do we know the Tupi Guarani speakers actually expanded rather than just the language? After all, languages can be adopted or abandoned by speakers for a variety of reasons. In fact, a very good example of this can be seen in the Kokama people of the western Amazon. These people also speak a Tupi Guarani language, but genetic studies have shown that they are much more closely related to Arawak speaking populations, and scholars speculate that at some point the Kokama picked up Tupi Guarani and stopped speaking their native Arawakan language. These are very fair points, but archaeologists have noted that the surviving material culture in the archaeological record maps pretty well with historical linguistic boundaries. Genetic studies have also borne out a strong ethnic connection between most of these speakers. So scholars are pretty confident that the descendants of these Tupi Guarani share a common ethnic origin. This is all important because these Tupi Guarani would leave a huge impact across South America. If you thought those Proto-Tupi liked to spread out, you ain't seen nothing yet, because we see evidence of their movements all over the continent. Archaeology and linguistics show that they spread out through modern Brazil and into parts of Bolivia, Paraguay, Uruguay, and even a few areas in Argentina. As some viewers may have guessed, this is also the group from which the modern Guarani people descend. Now, with all due respect and apologies to the Paraguayan and Guarani viewers out there, we aren't going to focus on the Guarani today. They are a fascinating people and culture unto themselves, and they deserve their own episode. Today, we are going to remain focused on the Tupinambá, who broke off from the Tupi Guarani about 3,000 years ago. Between 1000 and 500 BCE, various members of the Tupi Guarani began to expand from their home between the Xingu and Tocantins rivers. This expansion went out in several directions. The ancestors of the Guarani moved south towards modern day Bolivia and Paraguay. Others went up the Amazon River to the west, while the ancestors of the Tupinamba went down the Amazon to the Atlantic coast. And this is the leg of the expansion that we'll be looking at. Fun fact, the Tupi are believed to have encountered the Mar Johara people, and some scholars suggest that Mar Johara pottery may derive from Tupinamba pottery. Now, the Tupi didn't just stop on the coast. They kept going, pushing ever further south along the coast, even as far south as the Tropic of Capricorn. The strong similarities between the various Tupi languages on the coast is evidence that this was rapid. Archaeology shows that by 1 CE, the Tupinamba were inhabiting their historic lands. By crazy coincidence, the Tupinamba would run into their long lost Guarani relatives at the edge of their coastal range. The Guarani had expanded into the southern Brazilian and Uruguayan coasts. Now, I use the word expansion rather than migration, and that's important. These Tupian populations were not migrating. They remained in areas that they settled, while parts of the population broke off, moved to new areas, and settled them. The old territories were never abandoned, and archaeology shows that these core areas were still inhabited by the Tupi Guarani for thousands of years. The reasons for this large and rapid expansion remain the subject of debate among scholars. Some scholars have cited population pressure as an important factor in the expansion. They've noted that as historic Tupi Guarani settlements grew, they subdivided into new units, and those units left to stake out new territory for new villages, and this could have been an important incentive for expansion. I think it's also fair to speculate that their regular movements to find new settlements where soil was still fertile probably played a role in this. Other scholars have appealed to the Tupi Guarani's penchant for war. As I mentioned earlier, Tupi Guarani cultures had a strong war ethos, and this may have likely fueled territorial expansion. Recently, however, improved climatic studies have shown that the late Holocene was a wetter time period, and that this triggered an expansion of forests. This forest expansion over the centuries would have provided the Tupi Guarani with a larger, yet familiar environment to expand into. Remember what we said, they were well adapted to a landscape of rivers and forests, so the expansion of forests was probably a welcome development. Now, when the Tupinamba arrived into these coastal areas, they were not virgin landscapes. They had been inhabited for thousands of years by a people known as the Sambaqueros. Sambaqueros take their name from the sambaqui, which are large shell middens, some of which can be as tall as 30 meters. Fun fact, sambaqui is actually a Tupi word for a shell mound, which I thought was cool. We won't say much about them here beyond that they were hunter-gatherers and fishermen living off the coastal flora and fauna. Some scholars have proposed that they were related to speakers of modern J languages based on genetic studies. Whoever they were, the Tupinamba appear to have displaced or incorporated them, and this is very clear in archaeology. Sambaqui pottery stopped appearing in the archaeological record at this time, and they were replaced with Tupinamba pottery. With our current evidence, it's difficult to say with certainty how violent this process was. But regardless, by 1 CE, the Tupinamba had completely taken over most of the southeastern Brazilian coast and ended millennia of Sambiquero occupation. Okay, that was long, but now we have finally arrived at the Tupinamba in their milieu. Let's take a look at how they were living. Like their ancestors, the Tupinamba lived in villages that included a territory that was called a tecoaba, and these were delineated by landmarks and rivers. This would have included farmland as well as forests for hunting and rivers and coastlines for fishing. The various villages and camps throughout the tecoaba were connected by paths to allow easy communication and travel. If we look at the site of Alto do Torau in the state of Bahia, two large villages were excavated only 500 meters apart, so these could be pretty close to each other. French colonist John de Lery would report that a typical village had about 500 to 600 people living in it. According to other historical sources, the Tupinamba lived in large multifamily longhouses made of wood and straw, which they called ocas. Jesuit missionary Manuel de Nobrega described them as being large enough to accommodate 50 married men and their wives and children. Wood and straw may sound like flimsy materials, but remember that these were people who relocated their settlements every few years as soils became exhausted, so there really wasn't a reason to build anything permanent. As you can imagine, these houses were very vulnerable to fire, and they could easily go up in flames during an assault. Modern estimates report that each longhouse probably had 135 people living inside. Each village had about 7 longhouses that were often arranged in a circle or arc around a central plaza, and that these were surrounded by a wooden palisade made out of palm trunks to protect against attacks and jaguars. Accounts note that the Tupinamba kept fires lit all night to ward off such dangers. The Tupinamba subsisted primarily on agriculture. The most important crops were manioc, sweet potato, maize, squash, peanuts, and beans. In particular, manioc, or cassava as it's also called, was a very important crop that was the proverbial bread and butter of Tupinamba diets. In fact, the word manioc comes from the Tupi word manioca. This carbohydrate rich tuber not only thrives in poor soils, but was also a very versatile crop. The manioc varieties grown by the Tupi were often toxic and had to be prepared by soaking or fermenting them to neutralize the toxins. After the manioc was properly prepared, it could be consumed directly, but was often ground into a flour. This manioc flour could be used to make breads or cakes. It could also be used in porridges or mush that could be kept or transported easily. Flour could also be ground from a root that Hans Stadten's account calls ipi, but my research assistant and I were not able to determine what plant this corresponds to. If anyone knows, let us know in the comments. Maize was also an important crop grown by the Tupinamba, and while it could be consumed directly, it was most often turned into chicha, or maize beer. Manioc was also fermented and turned into kawim. Kawim was brewed by women and stored in large pots and jars until village ceremonies called for it. Deliri comments on the extent of the drunken revelry during these occasions, but also notes that they were a good time enjoyed by many, merrily celebrating together. The Tupinamba practiced swidden agriculture, or slash and burn agriculture, and this dictated a lot of their life. This forced the Tupinamba to move their villages every few years, sometimes more frequently, to a new place within the Tecoaba, although conflicts within the wider Tecoaba could prompt a wholesale relocation. Anyone who's had to deal with an HOA knows that tensions can boil over pretty easily in a small community. Historical accounts state that women managed the farming while men hunted and fished. Game such as tapir, deer, peccary, and other small game and fowl were regularly hunted, while rivers and the sea provided sources of fish and mollusks. One thing that I found interesting about Tupinamba fishing is that they never used nets, instead using lines and hooks or bows and large arrows to fish. After contact with the Europeans, however, they would adopt net fishing. Forests also provided various nuts, berries, and fruits from trees and palms. Society was organized around villages, and each village was headed by a chief called a tujwai. Historical sources note that the tujwai's position was earned by merit, particularly by martial success. Now, chiefs didn't rule communities entirely on their own. Elders who had built strong reputations throughout their lives also wielded considerable influence in communities. Prominent males in Tupinamba communities also practiced polygamy and could have multiple wives depending on their status and success. Jesuit accounts from the contact period observed that a man could have 3 to 4 wives, and that a great leader could have between 10 and 20. Leaders and even heads of household were expected to be very generous and hospitable to visitors, and to house and feed them. Traits like selfishness, dishonesty, and melancholy were very discouraged. Villages kept in regular contact with each other, but historical sources don't provide much evidence for trade and exchange between different villages and tecoabas. While they document that exotic feathers and rare stones were traded, they stress that the villages were pretty self sufficient and that goods were locally produced. Nevertheless, gift giving between villages helped reinforce relationships and reciprocity. Now, one way in which villages collaborated extensively was war. As I mentioned earlier, the Tupinamba and their ancestors were a pretty bellicose people with a strong warrior ethos. Wars were actually more like vendettas that were often fought to settle disputes, avenge past wrongs, and take captives, as well as to enhance the reputations of individual warriors. When conflict arose, elders would rally warriors from different villages to assemble raiding parties. Warriors fought with large bows and arrows that so impressed Jean Deliri that he considered English longbows to be inferior. Others were armed with large sharpened war clubs called ibirapema, with leather bucklers for catching arrows. Seniority among warriors was determined by age and experience. These war parties would be furnished with food, and ceremonies would be conducted to ensure victory. Witnesses report that warriors would travel by boat, sometimes hundreds of miles into enemy territory, and attempt to ambush their enemies. And if successful, capture enemy warriors as well as women to take back as captives. Warfare could be ferocious, but surviving warriors earned lifelong respect and status for their achievements on the battlefield. Now we arrive at one of the most odious and sensational aspects of Tupinamba culture: cannibalism. The Tupinamba and the wider Tupi gained notoriety throughout Europe for this practice, and this in turn was used to justify their enslavement and mistreatment at the hands of colonists. Because of this, a few scholars, most famously William Ahrens in his 1979 book The Man-Eating Myth, have tried to claim that accounts of cannibalism were fabricated by European colonists to justify colonial endeavors. This position is understandable, and indeed, it is tempting to chalk these accounts up to racism and conspiracy. While some accounts are routinely singled out by historians for lacking credibility or being very embellished, there are many accounts from people who lived among them who personally witnessed this practice and recorded it in detail that is confirmed in other accounts. Some of these writers were actually quite sympathetic to the Tupinamba people. On the basis of these accounts, the vast majority of scholars agree that cannibalism was practiced by the Tupinamba. With that said, we need to explain what this practice was and what it wasn't. And to do that, we need to analyze this on the Tupinamba's own terms. Cannibalism was not practiced wantonly. It's not like you could walk into a Tupinamba village and order someone for dinner. People were not a menu item, and you would probably get a lot of alarmed looks if you asked. Think of it this way: if you live in a country that practices capital punishment, it doesn't give you license to go around executing whoever you want. There are typically very strict rules and processes around it. Likewise, cannibalism was a fate reserved for very specific people, specifically captured enemy warriors. This practice, referred to by anthropologists as exocannibalism, was reserved for people outside the group that were commonly regarded as despised enemies. It's worth noting that not all war captives were destined for the dinner platter. Historical accounts note that captives could even marry into the community or be put to work if they had a special skill that was in demand. When these people were executed and consumed, however, strict ritual protocols were observed that involved several villages coming together, drinking kawam with the captives, and exchanging various boasts and insults. According to Deliri, the captive would be given a ceremonial opportunity to avenge himself before the executioner would arrive and execute him, after which the women would clean the body and cook it. Enemy skulls were kept as trophies, and some bones were used to make musical instruments. The consumption of enemy flesh was an act of vengeance of the highest order, but one that also provided the victim with an honorable death. This might seem puzzling to us, but multiple European witnesses who were able to speak to captured warriors marked for cannibalism always recorded that these warriors saw their own consumption as an honorable death. According to Jean Deliri, for the warriors who captured and consumed the flesh of their foes, they were elevated in status and guaranteed a happy and honorable afterlife, and he notes that this was done to strike fear into their enemies. Executioners who executed these captives were physically scarred as a mark of honor, so that enemy warriors would recognize them and see their tally on their body. What's important here is that cannibalism was a thing among the Tupinamba, but I hope that you can see it in clearer context now. These people were not just chowing down on people whenever they liked. Whatever our misgivings may be, and I imagine that they are numerous, we need to see this as a highly regulated and ritualized practice, motivated not only by revenge, but also by notions of honor and martial prowess. Speaking of the afterlife, let's talk about Tupi religion and beliefs. According to historical records, the Tupinamba did not have an organized religion with priests and temples, but still had an elaborate cosmology. The principal deity of the Tupi was Tupan, the god of thunder. For those who lived a virtuous and courageous life, they joined Tupan in the afterlife. For those who were unworthy, they were tormented in the afterlife by Aignan, who was considered a dark and evil spirit and was often described as a jaguar. The Tupinamba also had shamans and soothsayers called page who would journey to different villages. They would conduct ceremonies using maracas to channel the spirits of the ancestors and to prophesize. The louder the maracas sounded, the closer the ancestors were, and in successful ceremonies, we're told that the maracas could speak with the voices of the dead. Such ceremonies could be used to determine when war should be declared. The Tupinamba took their dead seriously, and we can get a good look at this by looking at their mortuary traditions. Although few intact burials survive, we know that many people were buried in large burial urns or had their bones reinterred in pots with many grave goods, as in other Amazonian cultures. This doesn't appear to have been the mode for everyone, but they are the ones that have survived best. According to French colonist André Tevet, the Tupi preferred not to have bones touch the soil when they were buried, hence the burial urns. He also mentions that offerings were made at the grave site to ward off Aignan from consuming the body. For about 2,000 years, the Tupinamba adapted to life on the coast and its hinterlands, and they thrived. I imagine they would have kept chugging for many more centuries, but all that changed with the arrival of the Portuguese and other Europeans. We saw in the introduction that contact with the Tupinamba was polarizing. On one hand, these were people who prized hospitality and virtue and were welcoming to strangers, but they were also brutal and vicious to their enemies. Unlike the Spanish, the Portuguese were slow to set up colonies in Brazil. During the late 15th and early 16th centuries, they were focusing their energies on the Indian Ocean and the Far East to tap into the very lucrative trade over there. Thus, for the first few decades after its discovery, the Portuguese made no serious attempts to establish colonies in Brazil, though there were likely still moments of contact between Portuguese sailors and natives. It's not until the 1530s and 1540s that the first Portuguese settlements finally started to be established on the coast. One of the most important trade items during this time was the very thing that gives Brazil its name today, Brazil wood. The wood of the Brazil wood tree produces a red dye that was in high demand in Europe. Later on, cash crops, especially sugar, would become a very important industry in Brazil. In these early years, relations between various Tupinamba groups and the Portuguese were pretty good, and there are well known instances of colonists living among the Tupi. However, as these settlements grew, so did tensions. These settlements and colonial operations required labor, and to the unscrupulous colonists, the heathen Tupinamba were right there. Thus, the Tupinamba became targets of slave raids and conquest for the Portuguese. As Tupi slaves died of disease and mistreatment, the Portuguese had to replenish these losses by raiding more Tupinamba communities and enslaving more people, creating a vicious cycle. Another important element of Portuguese colonization were Jesuit missionaries. The Jesuits first arrived in the modern state of Bahia, Brazil in 1549, under the blessings of King João III. For the crown, converting the locals to Christianity was, in theory, an important justification for the colonization of Brazil. When they first arrived, the Jesuits wanted to convert the native Tupi through persuasion rather than force, and they began their evangelization by visiting nearby Tupinamba villages to preach to the inhabitants, incorporating indigenous music and dancing into their preaching. Although they abhorred the Tupinamba's cannibalism, drinking practices, and polygamy, they also condemned their enslavement by the Portuguese and successfully got the authorities to limit Indian enslavement to instances of ransoming and captives captured in a just war. This work often put the Jesuits at odds with the colonists, who saw these actions as cutting off their supply of cheap labor and land. While early efforts appeared to show a lot of promise, reversals and setbacks prompted the Jesuits to take a new approach, the aldea. Aldeas were basically the Portuguese version of Spanish missions. These were communities headed by Jesuit missionaries in which native communities were consolidated and settled within. With the aid of some truly devastating military campaigns against the Tupinamba, the survivors were settled into the aldeas where the children could be instructed and the adults could be put to work. On the bright side, these aldeas protected their residents from enslavement and certain colonial abuses, and in theory, they held lands in trust for the natives. Unfortunately, the residents were subjected to oppressive restrictions and forced labor. Despite that, the massive aldeas proved very difficult to sustain as farmland for the inhabitants was often poached by other colonists. The aldeas were also breeding grounds of disease, and the indigenous residents soon began to die off in staggering numbers, which left them stunned and demoralized. To put this decline in sharp perspective, Jesuit accounts report that in 1561, there had been 14 aldeas in Bahia with some 40,000 natives living in them. By 1583, there were only 3 remaining aldeas with only 10,000 natives, but that number may be high because the report includes Christian natives enslaved on plantations. Unsurprisingly, many people fled the aldeas. Thus, many Tupinamba were either enslaved, gathered into aldeas, or retreated into the Brazilian interior, and this tragic pattern was a shared experience for many Tupi peoples over the next few centuries. That's not to say that the Tupinamba didn't attempt any resistance. They did, most famously by the Tamoio Confederation. This was formed by several Tupinamba tribes that banded together near modern day Rio de Janeiro to resist Portuguese incursions, and they actually had help from a very unlikely partner, the French. The French? As it turns out, the lack of colonial effort by the Portuguese prompted the French authorities to make a move on the Brazilian coast. In 1555, the French would establish a short lived colony called France Antarctique at Niterói in 1555, which is where the accounts of Jean Delisle and André Teve come from. Now, this caught the attention of the Portuguese, and they managed to kick the French out in 1560. Although it should be noted that the colony was in a lot of turmoil because of religious disputes between Calvinists and Catholics living in the colony. This is why we can't have nice things, 16th century France. Now, this wouldn't be the end of French presence in Brazil because the French would attempt a few other colonies there, and they would find ready allies among the local Tupinamba and other Tupi people. Unfortunately, these efforts at Tupi resistance, as well as French colonial ambitions, would be stomped out by the Portuguese, and the Tupi survivors fled into the Brazilian interior to escape the Portuguese reprisals and slave raids. By 1612, the French were ousted from South America for good, with the exception of French Guiana. Without French support, the Tupinamba were often at the mercy of colonial expansion and enterprise. After Brazilian independence, many Tupi would endure poverty and find work in the nation's expanding cacao industry, where many still work today. A survey from 1991 in Bahia recorded that over 70% of the largely Tupi indigenous population was illiterate. Thankfully, things are slowly improving for the Tupi and other Brazilian indigenous groups. After decades of fighting for official recognition in the late 20th century, the Brazilian government finally recognized the Tupinamba as an indigenous tribe. In 2004, the Tupinamba of Serra do Padiro recovered ancestral land and were permitted to open their own schools. Despite the challenges they faced, the Tupinamba and their Tupi brethren have endured. The Tupi even have some impressive cultural currency among modern Brazilians. Brazil's national rugby team is affectionately nicknamed the Tupis. Many Brazilians may be familiar with Oswald de Andrade's famous line, Tupi or not Tupi, that is the question, from his famous 1928 essay, Anthropophagic Manifesto. Also, that's not a translation, the original quote is in English. Not only is this a great Shakespeare-worthy pun, but De Andrade uses imagery of the Tupi as cannibals to argue in the essay that Brazilian writers and artists should metaphorically cannibalize European and native influences to create something uniquely Brazilian. Unfortunately, I think that this also shows how cannibalism dominates the Tupi and Tupinamba's historical reputations. Rather than seeing them as barbarians, as many Portuguese colonists did at contact, I find it far more rewarding to see the Tupinamba as fearless movers extraordinaire. These were people who had moved enormous distances over millennia, far away from their ancient ancestral home. Archaeology and linguistics show that over 2 millennia they expanded down the Amazon to the eastern coasts of South America, all the way to the boundaries of the tropics. To do this, they had to perfect means to not just survive, but to thrive in the Amazon, and then had to adapt that knowledge to a coastal environment. All the while, they preserved a strong and distinct culture and fought tenaciously to preserve areas that they settled. While many have dismissed them as barbarians or lauded them as paragons of primitive simplicity, I hope that you can appreciate that there's far more to the Tupinamba than meets the eye. And that's going to wrap us up for today. Special thanks to my patrons listed here. You guys are the best. Also, special thanks to Carlotta, who helped me with the Portuguese pronunciation and answered a lot of my stupid questions. If you would like to join the ranks of these fine individuals and support the show, you can do so on Patreon. The link will be in the description. Don't forget to subscribe, like the video, and follow us on Facebook. Take care, and we'll see you in our next episode.